In the 20-plus years of helping people plan for the cost of retirement and long-term health care, we've identified one consistent theme among families and caregivers. People don't like to talk about money. Lifecare Affordability Planning helps families who are facing long-term health issues and increasing health-related expenditures to make better informed financial decisions during a time when there are so many unanswered questions. It's time to face this topic head-on, address the emotional charge of discussing money, and discover practical ways to bridge the gap between a long-term health care plan and your ability to pay for it.
Hello and welcome to Lifecare Affordability Planning with Tom, West and Arvette Reid from Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. I want everybody on the podcast to know today I am clueless. I have absolutely no idea what we're talking about today because Professor Tom is in the building and he is teaching a class today and I am going to learn lots. And Arvette's there too. And she is, I don't know what she's doing today. So let's find out. Arvette, Tom, what's going on?
Hello.
No, I was just trying to think of Eric coming into the conversation clueless, and
Absolutely.
I figured I'd just avoid the obvious gag. So today, what we're going to be talking about, Eric, and should you choose to participate, and I hope you do, we're going to be talking about how do you manage somebody else's money when you might not be sure about how you're managing your own money, and how do you make decisions in the face of so much uncertainty regarding how long somebody might live or what kind of help they might need. Because this is a situation that we've got, family members across the country being thrown into every day. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would just put it to you, the two of you, imagine that you're primarily responsible for taking care of somebody that you love. And in addition to managing your own life and managing the plan of care that is hopefully going well to take care of somebody, you now realize that you're the one named on the durable power of attorney to manage property and investments and whatnot. You're the one named perhaps by the court in a conservatorship about, listen, the court says, Arvette, congratulations, you got to run all the money. Or maybe you're the successor trustee where somebody is less able. And as we're sitting here talking, you for the first time realize that, wow, it's my responsibility and my name's on there. So I sort of put it to Arvette, like, what's your first reaction as potentially being awarded this fantastic responsibility of managing somebody else's money?
Yeah, we go right back to the people don't talk about money. And so I just stall.
Just freak out.
Yeah. Okay, next, let's talk about something else.
Yeah, and where do you think you would start? In terms of the non-professional, somebody that's got some family experience and professional experience, but just do you have a good idea of where you would even start?
I think it was interesting in going through this in my own life. Once I joined the firm here, my eyes opened up to how I could do it. And it helped me realize that from my 15 years of senior housing and healthcare, there were certain steps that I just knew how to take because that was my profession. Yeah. And what I found interesting is in the financial world, you have certain steps that you always take, but the rest of us don't know those things.
Right. So I think that one of the things that we're going to start with, I think a pretty easy concept for what's a process for making decisions in general, whether they be financial decisions, whether they be healthcare decisions, business decisions, and whatnot. But a place to start is getting a full awareness of what the circumstances are that you're in, like what's going on.
Right.
How do you organize the information that you need to make decisions? Do you know where all of the money is? Do you have a sense of what the balance sheet looks like, where all of the different assets and liabilities are? Do you know what the cash flow looks like?
Well, some people haven't even done a balance sheet ever.
Yeah. I know. So
Tom,
go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, before we get started too deep into this, I got to say that you asked the question and it really brought up some anxiety in me because the first thing I thought about is I reflected on my own situation, my own finances, my wife and I, and I'm thinking, what a mess. We have, the accounts that we have in different locations, the different subscriptions that we have. I mean, who's going to keep my Netflix running? Just from the mundane to the simple to all these other things that are automatic payments these days. I can't imagine somebody having to walk into my mess trying to help me figure it out or run it for me, not knowing everything. And you put it on my shoulders now to do that for somebody else. And maybe that person has some cognitive impairments. Maybe that person can't communicate as well as they could 5 years ago. And if we haven't had these conversations, I'm in a world of hurt right now so I'm in the panic bus with Arvette.
Yeah. Well, I think, well, I mean, the audience heard that I was going to go down the path of organization, but I think with Eric's appropriate interruption about I don't even know where my own stuff is. Well, let's think a little bit about just the responsibility, Eric, that you and your wife have of your own stuff. You're in charge of you. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's actually a different standard of care and I think this is part of what a lot of us sense in terms of what's anxiety building. Listen, if it's my own stuff, I kind of know where it is, sort of, and I wouldn't want to hand this off, but yeah. I give myself permission to treat my own situation in an unorganized, haphazard pattern.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But when I've got the responsibility of doing this for somebody else, it's sort of like, you get pucker face, like, okay, yeah. I got to execute a standard of care that might be a lot higher than what I'm doing for myself. Mm-hmm. And I think that leap, Eric, that what you were talking about, that's part of what freaks everybody mm-hmm. out, because maybe their stuff in their own house isn't all buttoned up, and it feels like even an extra leap to go to a higher standard of decision-making and protocol when I know that I'm responsible for somebody else's money. And just think about, for a lot of families, there's even an additional pressure where maybe you've got siblings that are giving you the side eye right. about mm-hmm. managing stuff. Maybe there's, other beneficiaries of a trust that are kind of wanting to see how you make these decisions about how much money are you spending on mom's care? Do you have any conflicts of interest? Like those additional pressures above and beyond just needing to elevate the standard of care in terms of managing something else, that's real and that's anxiety inducing. And coming back to what Arvette was talking about, man, people don't talk about this, mm-mm. but where do you start? Well, you start probably a lot of times just in freak out mode, right. where you procrastinate, you bounce around a lot of worry in your head. And I think that the purpose really of this podcast is, Lifecare Affordability Plan team, like what are the practical steps? What are the 5 things that you actually can do? Like if I was going to write down 5 bullets coming out of this podcast, so what do we actually do so I can break this into smaller pieces and actually make some progress? Because one of the things that our earlier series of podcasts have done is really talked about some of the risks that we run with inattention to finances.
Right.
So my suggestion would be, let's think a little bit about how we organize our material. And in Arvette, I would put it a little bit to you as the professional coming from senior housing and healthcare. Think about ways that professionals arrive at a plan of care first. You just don't jump in mm-hmm. and prescribe a medication and home care like right out of the gate just as somebody comes right in. You stop. You go through a handful of different diagnostic processes to sort of figure things
right,
out.
And to gather the information.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about the discovery that you do in senior housing and healthcare to ascertain some health and living and social needs. And my overwhelming suspicion is there's a lot of parallels with the way you sensitively gather information that could serve this new responsibility of managing somebody else's money.
Yeah, I think the idea of organizing the information before you leap is very important, not only from a healthcare viewpoint, but also from financial. So from the healthcare viewpoint, when someone has some kind of illness or some kind of diagnosis, you start going back and looking at old records. You start rethinking behaviors. What has happened in the past year? Have I noticed something? Maybe I saw it, but at the time it didn't register. But now that I have this new diagnosis, it all makes sense. So it's really important to get all the information out of your head, out of your family's head, out of whoever, and write it down so that everybody can look at the same information, right? Because you can't make a plan until you have all the information.
Right.
Because sometimes, example for dementia, someone could have a dementia diagnosis Or someone could have just had a urinary tract infection, which also can cause short-term dementia. So if all of a sudden someone shows a sign of dementia and you jumped into moving them to an assisted living.
Right, and they have a UTI.
Yeah, that's not necessarily where they need to be. So.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I want you to. One of the things that you said that was interesting is looking back on previous patterns to identify and inform what our current situation is. Let's also think about progress we've made in previous podcasts about imagining what families are most hopeful for and what families are most afraid of.
Right.
And I think that actually comes in the organization and the discovery stage, where before we decide to make a whole bunch of decisions, just stop. Given what we know about the healthcare circumstance and the financial circumstances, what are the outcomes that we're most hopeful for? How do we really build that out as thoroughly as possible? And we start there. And then we also talk about, what are some of the outcomes that we're most fearful of that might give us the most anxiety to move forward in the decision-making process, and we identify that. Because those two things, those boundaries of what we're most hopeful for and what we're most afraid of, that almost gives us sort of the range of choices that we are building towards as time goes on.
Yeah, I call them the bumpers.
Yeah, the bumpers. There you go.
Keeps you in a lane.
Yeah, I like that. So let's think of that as step number one: organize and fully discover and be aware of the situation you're in before you jump to any of the other ones. Remember, sometimes when people are going through different kinds of anxiety or grief, there is an instinct to act. There's an instinct to ready, fire, aim. Some of us, duck and cover and procrastinate and deny. Others just decide to, I feel anxious and I need to care about somebody and I need to do something. And that's my...
It's been really interesting, though, watching as we work with clients on the Lifecare Affordability Plan, and we're in the organized phase.
Yeah.
The list of things that we give to clients is not a list that I ever saw prior to working here.
Yeah.
And so the idea of organizing what? So if I was listening to this, where do I go to find that first list of stuff to just pull together?
No, that's a good question. Well, I think that you start with what's coming in the mailbox. Where are the most recent statements? That's a place to start. And, sometimes it takes families 1, 2, 3 months worth of watching the mail just to get the gross information to start putting together what the cash flow looks like and what the balance sheet looks like. So that's a place to start, looking at different statements. Another piece, too, that you want to do is, what does the tax return look like? Hopefully there's been taxes filed, so we'd at least be able to see what's been reported as income and what some of the deductions might be that we've taken in the past. Those are probably some of the places to start. The other thing is, if we're in a period of care that costs additional money, well, we need to know what that additional expense might be, because that might be new to the house. That might not be something that you'd be able to pull out of 2 years ago. We weren't in an assisted living facility. So this is where we were, and now we've got an assisted living. That sort of informs the way that we set out the financial information that we need. But sometimes it's as easy as wait by the mailbox for a full cycle of statements coming in and start there. That's a good question. So step number 2 is talking about evaluating the different options and identifying the different options that you, as the person responsible for the financial decisions, really have to make. And a lot of times people will think first, well, what do I do with investments? What do I do with, these oddball bank accounts or IRAs or whatnot? And the reason that we don't evaluate options first, the reason we think through the discovery and the organization first, is we should have already identified the things that we're most hopeful for. We should have already identified the outcomes that cost money that we might be most afraid of. The answer to the question on figuring out your different options is, what are the different choices that we need to make that give us as a household and you as a decision maker the highest probability of paying for things that you're most hopeful for. So, and I'll give you an example. If you've got $500,000 in oddball investments and cash and IRAs and all over the place, and you determine after looking at cash flow and expenses and whatnot that you need that $500,000 to generate an additional $30,000 of income, per month or per year to be able to pay for care, then the job of that money should be, what do I need to do with that $500,000 to be able to pay for $30,000 a year, which might change down the road, but in the best possible way. And then the sets of options that you think of is you're working sometimes with a financial advisor or a brokerage or somebody at the bank to identify this new job of the money for that my $500,000 is to generate $30,000 a year. What are the different options that can move me in that direction? What different choices are there with mutual funds or stocks or bonds or whatnot? Because interestingly enough, if you have $500,000 assigned the job of generating $30,000 a year, it's a very different allocation and strategy and set of options as if you had $1 million or $250,000. So the money that you start with is material in what the set of options are that you've got, but you always want to go through the step of evaluating all of the different ways that you could consider to get there. And I'm sure parallels different things that you see in senior housing and healthcare before you immediately jump to an assisted living, for example, on a plan of care. There's a whole lot of consideration of some different alternatives as well.
Yeah, I think the evaluate stage, for those of you who have gone through trying to analyze how to help a loved one in a healthcare situation, is when you start touring places and you start making phone calls and you start trying to get an idea about how much this healthcare stuff is going to cost. So just like sometimes on the financial side, people are jumping in blind, like I've never had to deal with this before. Most families jumping into healthcare side, it's the same way. When I worked at the assisted livings, I had families coming in like, yeah, my dad just got diagnosed with dementia. I have no idea what this place costs, right? So you're really gathering information so that you can evaluate what your choices are. And what's interesting is not everybody knows, Tom, that $500,000 has to then generate an additional 30. Like, not everybody can think that way. So the key is first figure out, evaluate what kind of services you may or may not need and what your options are. And then someone hopefully can help you see that you need to generate an extra 30. That's the part I don't think I would have ever gotten to by myself.
Yeah, and this is part of the reason that I think these podcasts serve so much, because as somebody that thinks in financial terms with 20, 25 years or however long I've been doing this, right, it's natural for me to pivot back and forth with assets and cash flow and whatnot. I think it's important for the audience to think that long-term care expenses and the way that you have to pay for it, it's an income problem. It's not a how much money you have problem.
Right.
It's how much money you can generate on a regular basis to pay for the incoming bills that might change. So I use language like that whenever I get sort of the glazy eyes, which maybe I just glazed your eyes over.
Yeah, the 500,000 generate 30,000.
Yeah,
Eric, I don't know about you.
Yeah, she was giving me the talk human look. What I go back with is like, listen, we need to figure out a way to pay for it predictably in a way that can last as long as possible. And we want to evaluate, just like you're going through, I think appropriately, families need to evaluate different options about, am I going to be staying at home? And if not, is an adult daycare like Insight Memory Care Center that we talked about earlier, is that appropriate? Or an assisted living? Like, you got to go through and you got to look at your different range of options. And that's going to be true whether you're considering different kinds of investments, annuities, mutual funds, or whatnot. You have to have all of them on the table in order to be sure that when you winnow down, you're taking your responsibility of meeting a fiduciary standard that I've looked at different stuff. And after understanding different options, I chose this one. Yeah,
this is where I'd give a shout out to the aging life care professionals, because a lot of people out there, when you're stuck in this and you just don't know, the first step might be to hire someone like that to help you navigate, unless there's somebody around that has gone through it, that can jump around.
Right. And remember also when Eric was making a comment about what responsibilities are, I mean, I do have to put pressure on Arvette and Eric as listeners in this exercise. It's your job to look at different options. Right. Like you can't just do it's in a bank account and I'll just take it out of the bank account. No, the standard of care is what the courts say if you get sued is you have to look at different options and have to have a reason to pick the particular path that you're going in. Mm-hmm. If you never look around at different options, you're not meeting the standard of care that you should be from a legal standpoint, from a liability standpoint. So that's why we're walking through it, organize and discover, then evaluate some different options. So Eric.
I was just going to say that you have to try to strike a balance, because you brought it up earlier, and I have a picture of the ideal care for my parent, let's say, and it's going to be and they're okay with going into a facility that will help them. Maybe they've got some memory issues or whatever, and they're going to have all sorts of therapy that's going to help them with those issues. They're going to have round-the-clock care. They're going to have amazing meals, so on and so forth, and that may be my ideal, thought of what I want for them. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I have the fear of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? Where Grandpa Joe is sleeping in the dining room and because money's run out, and now his bed's right there, and we're having dinner, eating on his bed, which is just weird. So that's my biggest fear. How do you want to be a good, I don't know if it's a good fiduciary or it's your responsibility to weigh all those different options, but how do you strike that balance where you eliminate fear from the situation as much as you can, but you also say, okay, the gourmet meals that are going to be cooked by top chefs and have all this, that's just not going to be attainable with that $30,000 that's being generated by the $500,000 and the other income that's coming in from retirements or pensions or whatever else. How do you strike that balance and help people overcome the fear and be able to focus on what's truly possible?
I think that's a great question. And the only framework, Eric, that I think is helpful is defining the things that you're most hopeful for and that you're most afraid of. So imagine that if we're thinking of taking care of somebody that we love, going into a plan of care, there's sort of a hierarchy of priorities that sometimes families have to pick between. Mm-hmm. I would say, for example, and I'm going to give you an extreme case, but is it more important to make sure that mom has the highest end meals in the brass and mahogany place for 1 year while we can afford it, and then have to make a transition and we'll see where it goes then? Or is it more important that we have a plan of care that keeps her socialized and never being alone in a way that we know we can go on for 5 years?
Right.
Yeah,
and I'm using an extreme example of am I comparing a dining room experience that I can afford for a year versus socialization and combating loneliness that might be in a less expensive setting that I can afford for a longer period of time? I would, and I think a good care manager would come back to you and your family with something that says, is it more important to keep mom socialized and with people, or to have this brass and mahogany experience? Because that's sort of the forced prioritization that a good, hopeful, fearful conversation can suss out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what you said about the fiduciary standard, right? You have to look at the options. You have to be realistic as the person now responsible for the money of making decisions that are in the best interest of the person.
Right.
Right? Yeah. That is your responsibility. The other thing we have to just state again is that you are not making financial decisions in isolation. The financial decision should be driven by the healthcare needs and scenarios. And what are you most hopeful for and what are you most fearful of? They have to go hand in hand. So in the healthcare world, as we're dealing with families that are going through these issues, what is your goal, right? Is your goal for a cure? Is your goal for stabilization? Is your goal to manage a dignified death? What is your goal? And then once you have your goal, then you can figure out how the finances play to that.
Yeah,
right?
and I think when I was given the example of the socialization versus the dining room, I also think that it's important to recognize that it's more important to have a reason to make these financial decisions than it is to anticipate somebody else is going to be giving you the right set of priorities. So if, for example, Eric said, like, you know what, dining is more important than anything else,
right,
and we'll figure it out.
Mom was the chef, and Mom loves
Mom's
food.
a chef, and like I'll figure it out in a year. But the most important thing is you've got to identify what that priority is, and then you have to make subsequent decisions that support that. If you do that, then you are meeting the standard and you're meeting your responsibility. You just have to identify what it is that you're shooting at. Which dartboard am I shooting at? And I think that
and document it.
Yeah, and that's why you evaluate your different options and you document that, because that moves into the next piece, which is you actually have to write down what you're trying to accomplish. We're trying to make sure that, number one, mom stays in a standard of living in a manner to which she's accustomed for the longest period of time. And then after that can't be afforded any more than we need to keep her close to a local family member, something like that. And it's always different with different families or wealth setups or things like that. But once you identify what that plan is, what the specific goal is, we got to treat that as the dog that's wagging the tail. All of the subsequent decisions, and I believe about healthcare, but also about financial, like all of the subsequent decisions are beholden to those most important things that we talk about. That is a blend of sensitivities about things that we're most hopeful for and we're most afraid of. I'm really afraid mom's going to be alone, but right now I'm most hopeful. I'm balancing that with being most hopeful to keep her in a standard of living that she's accustomed to.
Yeah.
But I feel like, go ahead, Eric.
No, I just was agreeing with Tom.
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of the conversation we've been doing is still focused on the healthcare side and finding the right place. What are some good examples of the financial decisions that have to be made to support that?
Well, I think that one of the examples is whether you, as this person that's got the financial responsibility, choose to consolidate all of your money or not.
Okay.
If you've got accounts at 20 different places, okay, I would ask you the question, how is your goal of doing these things for mom or your husband or whoever it is, how is it served by having money in a whole bunch of different places? Because that added level of complexity is taking your attention. It's either you're not paying attention to all the 20 accounts, or it's making it more difficult to keep track of all those different things. So I would ask the question of, does it make sense to have all your money in all these different places? Does it make sense to sort of streamline? That would be an example. Another example would be, why are you in all these risky stocks? Why are you in 100% CDs? Those are the kinds of things that if you were to say, my portfolio needs to generate X amount of money to pay for this particular thing. Back to the thing, a good financial planner, and this is what Lifecare Affordability Plan does, we're able to look at it and like, this, your current setup doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. How about we set your money up in a way that serves those things that are most important to you? So I think that the next piece, and we've got two more steps happily that I think summarize pretty quickly. I think once you make the plan that you write down, this sounds sort of self-evident, but you actually have to do it as a discrete step. So you organize your stuff, you evaluate your options, you make a plan, but then you actually have to do it. And let's remember that in the face of uncertainty about how long somebody's going to live or when, how much help they're going to need, a lot of times people hesitate on decisions. A lot of times people procrastinate because they're not sure that this next step that they have all of the information. I think that financial decisions are no different. There needs to be an acceptance that people need to make some of these decisions with ambiguity. Like, I don't know exactly how this is going to turn out, but remember, your responsibility of managing money for somebody else is to make the best possible decision with the information that you have on hand.
And the other thing is, if you can't do it, if you're not going to be the person to execute it, you need to acknowledge that
and delegate.
And not just
Absolutely.
put the plan aside, but find the professional that's going to help you execute it.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a lot of the ways that families engage us.
No head in the sand.
Yeah, no head in the sand. It's like, listen, I need this pile of money to do the thing that supports what's most important to me, and you do it.
Right.
Now, interestingly, like for families that are responsible for making these decisions, it's still their responsibility. Even though they delegate it to professionals like us, it's still their name on the document.
Right.
So I think it's incumbent on all of the professionals that serve families in this situation to have a reporting mechanism that shows how these sets of decisions, once implemented, continue to support these new most important goals. And it has to be something that I would say is written down that you'd be able to show somebody else, because the last piece after you actually implement the decisions and execute on them, the last of our 5 steps is to develop a monitoring function. Just because you organize, because you evaluate options, make a plan, implement it doesn't mean you're done.
Doesn't mean it's working.
Doesn't mean it's working either. You got to have, is this working? Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes professionals make mistakes. And if things are going off, if the path is taking us off in the wilderness, like use your bumper metaphor, like if we're not in between the bumpers anymore, you got to go back and reset.
It's the same thing in healthcare when someone moves into a community or is getting services at home. They do ongoing care plans to make sure that the care that's being provided is exactly that care that's needed and nothing's changed. So I've learned the same thing on this side of the house. When we do the Lifecare Affordability Plan and we're helping people ongoing with monitoring, we're just making sure that we're all still marching in the same direction.
Right.
And it's very important. And I've also learned that people who were very skeptical of approaching a financial organization in the beginning, once you get through the monitor phase and you've been step by step with them along the way, there's a bit of confidence in them now that they understand some of the basics. They can't always do it themselves. They're still will delegate that out, but they're walking with a little bit more pride, like they know some of the language and they know that they're doing the right thing.
And I think that's key. How do we put these financial decision makers that have a responsibility that maybe they're not ready for or real excited about, but nevertheless, that's where you are. How do you put them in the position so that they know they're doing right by the person that they're trying to take care of? And I think that it all comes back to what is it that you're trying to do? And let's make sure that we've got a reporting and a monitoring mechanism that not just can validate that, but can set up the next chapter when we go back to the beginning. What's our current situation and how do we reevaluate options from there? So I think that the idea of those 5 steps, if we did this podcast right, it's important that professionals in senior housing and healthcare and families that are going through this feel like some of these concepts are accessible. It actually, if you break it down into smaller pieces, makes a lot of sense. And that's a lot of the method that we do with Lifecare affordability planning, and certainly is the theme that we bring all of our aligned professionals back to every time we talk about it and try to integrate plans of care.
Yeah, I think this was a great podcast to unpack. There's a ton here. I know we're really low on time. One thing that we didn't touch on that I'm hoping that you guys will consider doing another podcast on, and I know that you have so many connections, it may be an opportunity to bring in a guest as well. But the one piece that we didn't talk about today is the one person that we're taking care of and their thoughts on it. And so when you've got mom who wants those higher end meals like we were talking about, or mom that wants a certain type of care, how do you have that conversation and how do you guide the conversation along the way as they progress, whether in a disability or they progress health-wise downward? How do you have that continued conversation doing the best you can for your mother, your father, whoever you're taking care of, while at the same time maintaining the budget that you have to maintain as a fiduciary responsibility? I mean, that's a whole nother piece to this that we haven't scratched the surface on. Can we do a podcast on that?
We could do a podcast on that. That's sort of a combination of managing expectations, communicating with seniors with varying levels of ability. Yeah. What popped into my mind is any of the other parties that might be part of the decision-making process. You know, the daughter from California, the neighbor that means well but is always sticking her nose in and mucking things up. Yeah. Like, how do you message all of those? That's a great idea, and we'll put that on our list. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Tom, this was great. I appreciate it. I got a high level of education today. Any closing thoughts from either one of you before we wrap this up?
Lead with the things you're most hopeful with. Identify the things you're most afraid of. That's the boundaries that we need to make decisions for both healthcare and finance.
And don't be afraid to delegate. Just because you don't know, that doesn't mean you can't take the steps.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you guys.
And you got to talk about it.
Yeah, you have to talk about it. Absolutely.
You have to talk about it.
All right, and thank you all for joining us today on the Lifecare Affordability Planning Podcast with Tom and Arvette. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Tom and Arvette come out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. And if you have family that you need to broach this subject with, this is a great way to do it. give them the podcast, let them listen to it, and then just ask them what they thought, and then open that conversation, and then reach out to Tom and Arvette. They're great people. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at Lifecare Affordability Planning, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Views and opinions provided herein are those of the individual speakers. All content is informational only and is not intended to be an endorsement or recommendation of any particular investment strategy or other course of action. Consult your tax, legal, and financial professions concerning your specific situation. Securities offered through Royal Alliance Associates Incorporated, member FINRA/SIPC. Advisory services offered through SEIA LLC. Royal Alliance Associates Incorporated is separately owned, and other entities and or marketing names, products, or services referenced here are independent of Royal Alliance Associates, Inc. Lifecare Affordability Plan is a marketing name for SEIA. Services related to evaluating the client's healthcare treatment plan are independent of and not endorsed by Royal Alliance Associates, Inc.